Shawn, welcome to Common Ground. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. That's good. So, why don't you give the overview? We have plenty of time to talk about this, and we'll get into the details after you do that.
That sounds great. I began this research when I was spending time at Harvard. I spent about 12 years at Harvard, and I was observing all these different patterns that caused some of the Harvard students to rise to the top and enjoy their experience there, and others seemed to underperform and feel depressed or not connect with the students in the ways that they wanted to, and we saw their grades slip and we saw their performance decline. So what I got interested in is studying what causes somebody to rise to the top and feel happy in the environment that they find themselves in. And while I started this research, I was working with some of the leaders in a field called positive psychology, which is a new movement in social psychology which attempts to study the positive side of the curve, not just depression disorder, but what causes us to feel meaning in life, what causes us to feel happy, our levels of optimism, all those different things. And what I started to realize is that optimism and happiness actually started to predict many of the outcomes that these Harvard students cared so much about, their productivity, their energy, their grades. So what I started to do was research this. At the time, I was working with a man named Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who asked me to help be the head teaching fellow for a course called Positive Psychology, which was the first time it had been taught at Harvard in a lecture format instead of just a seminar. And we weren't sure many students would take the class, but by the end of our time there, we had over 1,000 Harvard students that ended up taking this course. That's 1 out of every 6 Harvard students. What we started to realize was that these students who had all these opportunities and resources and intelligence still were not happy. They wanted to be able to focus upon a happiness that was in the present, not off in the future once they became CEO of a company or partner of an investment bank. But they were also very well educated about languages and philosophy and physics, but they were quite uneducated when it came to what causes us to feel happiness. At the time, I did a study that involved 1,600 Harvard students to find out what the connection was between happiness and success, and we saw that there was a lot of parallels between the patterns that some of the happiest students at Harvard were taking and the most successful ones. At that time, I started to get interested in not just Harvard students. I wanted to find out how this works for everyone, because when I had friends from Texas, which is where I grew up, come to visit me, they would look around at all these beautiful buildings and say, you're wasting your time studying happiness at Harvard, because seriously, what does a Harvard student possibly have to be unhappy about? What that question indicates is that happiness, they thought, should be based upon your externals. So if you are paid well, if you have a great job, if you're at a great university, then of course you'd be happy. So what I did was I took this research outside of the ivory tower, and over the past 2 years, I've traveled around working with companies and schools in the midst of this economic downturn to find out what this connection is between happiness and success and what patterns people use in order to create positivity in their lives. And what we started to realize is, and this is the basis and the heart of my book, The Happiness Advantage, and all of my research, is that we have the formula for happiness and success wrong, I believe, in society. I've traveled to 44 different countries over the past 2 years and recognized that we implicitly follow this formula almost every single place that I've gone, where we believe that if I work harder, I'll be more successful. And if I'm more successful, then I'll be happier. And what it turns out is, well, first of all, we know that that formula actually doesn't work. We think if I work 8 to 14 hours today, then I'll be happier. Or once I hit this weekend, then I'll be happier. Once I get that job or lose this weight or get into the school, then I'll be happier. If that formula actually works, then every student that got accepted to a college, or everyone who had a job, or everyone who got good grades or won a game should then be happy, and there shouldn't be anything else about it. But what we found is, these celebrities, these Harvard students, these Olympic athletes, these CEOs, these companies, many of them were very unhappy. And what we found was that the reason why that's occurring is scientifically the formula actually works the opposite order for our brains. That we found that if we can increase a brain's level of positivity, in the midst of our work, in the midst of the challenges that we have, then all of our success rates rise significantly. Every single business and educational outcome improves when a brain is positive, which is now what we're defining as the happiness advantage, which seems that our brains work better at positive than they do at negative, neutral, or stressed. So what I'm doing with this research is I'm working with large companies and schools. I've been working with many of the world's largest banks in the midst of this economic downturn, UBS and Credit Suisse and Morgan Stanley, and working with high schools around the world, working with women's colleges in Dubai, or working with school children in South Africa. And what we're finding is that if we can reverse this formula, we found that not only can we increase people's levels of happiness, but then all of their business and educational outcomes begin to improve as well.
Fascinating. Thank you. Talking with Shawn Achor here about the happiness advantage, the 7 principles of positive psychology that fuel success and performance at work. So first off, I need to ask this. What is the definition of happiness?
That's a great question. And as I mentioned in that little overview, that I've traveled to 44 different countries, and in the midst of that, almost every single country has sort of a different definition of happiness. In fact, almost every individual that I work with has a different definition of happiness. That doesn't stymie us as researchers as we thought it might originally, because what we allow people to do is to find happiness for themselves. So I have a formal definition. I just borrowed it from the ancient Greek definition, which means the joy we feel striving after our potential. So the happiness, and I'll just say that one more time, the joy that we feel striving after our potential. And that potential could be as a teacher, as a business person, as a student, as a parent, as a lover. When we feel like we're growing, when we feel like we're connecting to other people, when we feel like our skill sets are improving or we're becoming the type of person that we want to, we usually feel a joy even in the midst of the ups and downs and the vicissitudes of life. So I like that definition because it links in happiness is not just complacency. Happiness is linked in with the sense of us moving towards the potential. So it moves beyond a pleasure-centered happiness to one that's based upon meaning and upon growth. But what we do when we do this research is we allow people to define happiness for themselves. So if I said on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you right now? Even if we have different definitions of happiness, we can normally come up with a number on a scale of 1 to 10. Then as scientists, what we do is we try and see if your self-reports on that happiness relate to or predict other things, like your energy levels or your health or how many friends you have on Facebook or how productive you are. And as a result of that, if that number is then predictive, we then have a number that allows us to study happiness and see if we can try and increase it or decrease it.
Okay, thank you. Very fascinating. Well, I have the advantage of being able to speak to hundreds of people. Particularly, this is one of my favorite topics, happiness and joy and being glad you're alive versus not being alive. And I know that historically, going back, there was the perception that you kind of came in with a happiness quotient in a sense. And luckily, that's not true. And I know that you know this, and that's exactly what you're showing here with your research, is that we can actually reprogram ourselves to be happier.
You're exactly right, and I like how you say that you enjoy this topic. I joke with some of my friends that some of my colleagues study, depression, and they have to go around speaking about that all the time. So I feel like I have a great job getting to study happiness and joy. But one of the most pernicious myths that we have in society is that belief that happiness is something that's completely outside of your control. Right. Either that happiness is something that you find, it's something that just happens if good things happen to you, or much worse than that is that happiness is only defined by your genes. Now, I think that there's good reasons why we believed that for a while. There was a researcher up in Minnesota who was studying twins, and he found that if you have identical twins and they're raised apart, that they have different environments but same genes, and their happiness actually were very comparable on average. So what he concluded was that 80% of our happiness is based upon our genes. And if you believe that, and if you believe that there's no change after that original statistic, you have to